So welcome everybody, I'm Alex Kelham, I'm a partner at Lewis Silkin, and I am joined by 5 wonderful gala experts on this subject on alcohol advertising, and we're hoping this will be a nice, engaging, thought-provoking session on alcohol advertising. And given we are a relatively small group, let's try and make it as interactive, and if you've got bits that you want to chip in as well, provided we don't go over time, I'm sure there will be the ability to do that. We certainly left time for questions at the end. So we've been asked to look at the question, are regulators infantilising consumers of alcohol? Are they effectively thinking we cannot make our own mind up? Frankly, there are so many different approaches around the world that you will probably get a different answer to that question wherever you are. We're going to be looking at some of those different approaches so we can come up with some conclusions as we go along. But one thing that the prep for this session has definitely taught me is that there are all sorts of weird and wonderful approaches and odd decisions as a result around the world. So we're going to look at some of those and generally try and look at what's the direction of travel. In a moment, I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves and say a little bit about what the regime is like in their jurisdictions. But I thought it was worthwhile making sure we're all on the same page just in terms of terminology and things. I don't know how many people we have from overseas or how many people who don't normally work in alcohol advertising regulation. So just to clarify a couple of things, I wanted to mention, first of all, dark markets. So you've probably got a vague idea. Dark markets, we're referring to those markets where alcohol advertising or consumption is highly regulated. For the purpose of today, we're really talking about where consumption and or advertising is completely banned. There are a number of markets where there are strict restrictions or some types of alcohol are banned from advertising, but really think of those as grey markets. It's the likes of Saudi where we're talking about being truly dark. The second point I wanted to make was that there are lots of different approaches, particularly that might seem alien in the UK because we just treat alcohol as alcohol. Non-alcohol and low alcohol drinks are treated differently, but if it's got alcohol in it, generally you're going to be covered by the rules. In other jurisdictions, there is a distinction between either percentage of alcohol or different types of alcohol, beer and wine, spirits, etc. So just bear that in mind. When we're talking about non-alcoholic drinks or low alcohol drinks, just to be clear, we're not talking about Coca-Cola or orange juice, those are soft drinks in our parlance. We are talking about those non-alcoholic substitutes. And finally, we'll talk about surrogate advertising. This is, does everybody nod if you know what surrogate advertising is? Okay. I didn't know the term a few years ago because I think in the UK it isn't as relevant to us because alcohol advertising is relatively permissive. But in many countries, particularly the dark and grey markets, you see advertising for a alcohol brand in a product which isn't regulated. And actually it doesn't happen only in alcohol, it happens in other sectors. One of the most obvious examples of surrogate advertising is probably the Marlboro clothing brand that was introduced not long after the cigarette advertising ban. So it's that similar concept. And obviously there is regulatory issues around that sort of advertising. So my question to each of us on the panel is, how is alcohol advertising generally regulated in your jurisdiction, and are indeed the regulators infantilising the consumers? I'm going to kick off with a very brief overview of the position in the UK. How many people are from the UK here? Okay, about half and half. So hopefully you guys are familiar, but for those who are from overseas, generally alcohol advertising is permitted in the UK, but is subject to a number of fairly strict rules, basically to ensure that alcohol is promoted responsibly. There's particular concern around promotion to children, as you'd expect, which is people under 18, which is also our drinking age limit in the UK. And any advertising which seem to encourage excessive drinking or suggests that it enhances performance or bravado or social standing, all that sort of thing is strictly controlled. also anything that suggests that alcohol is therapeutic is problematic. Overall, though, we are fairly liberal. There is a move on some parts to try and make the rules more stringent. Particularly, there's a body who are lobbying for alcohol as sports sponsorship to be banned. However, not getting a huge amount of traction, certainly not getting as much traction as similar arguments in the betting community. And actually, some of the recent decisions from the ASA have been relatively balanced and suggesting they're taking a quite mature approach to this. I've got one example that illustrates that later. But interestingly, problem drinking in the UK is actually falling in amongst young adults. So perhaps the approach we've taken to date is working, or perhaps young adults are just socialising online more and not going out and getting hammered. But anyway, at the moment, I think the ASA are taking a relatively balanced approach, and compared to some of the other jurisdictions that we're going to hear about, I think we're probably the lightest regulatory landscape. So going to the other extreme, Nick, do you want to kick off and explain the position? And so I'll make sure I move the slide on so you can all see who we are.
Great. So I'm Nick O'Connell. I'm based in Saudi Arabia. The firm that I work for, Tamimi, we have offices across the Gulf and North Africa, so all of the Gulf Arab states as well as Egypt, Iraq, Jordan and Morocco. The position in those countries, obviously culturally, alcohol is haram, which means that it's prohibited, and as a result of that, or prohibited for Muslims, as a result of that, the way the different countries approach it, it's generally the general premise is that it's not allowed. However, that ranges from places like Kuwait or Saudi where it's prohibited full stop, so you can't legally have alcohol in Saudi Arabia, to countries where it's a bit more flexible. For example, in the UAE or in Bahrain or Qatar, you can actually, non-Muslims can buy alcohol in shops, etc. But the advertising aspect is something that, parking for a moment, the countries where you simply can't buy it, therefore obviously you can't legally advertise it, it tends not to be permitted to advertise it at all. Now, the way that that's addressed is either in terms of prohibitions on advertising that is un-Islamic or contrary to morality, etc. So it doesn't specifically say alcohol can't be advertised, but the implication is that because alcohol is un-Islamic, it can't be advertised, through to, in some jurisdictions in the region, specific reference to prohibitions on alcohol being advertised. So the black letter approach is essentially for countries in the region where alcohol is prohibited, it's still not allowed to advertise it. Having said that, at a practical level, we do see some element of alcohol advertisements in some quite narrow contexts. So, for example, within licensed premises or within venues for particular events, so venues that are closed off to the public, etc. So I think I'll pause there and let someone else comment.
Violetta, do you want to go next?
Oh, yes. My name is Violetta Kunze. I'm a partner with the Bulgarian member of the Gala Alliance, Djingov, Gouginski, Kyutchukov and Velichkov, based in Sofia, Bulgaria. Well, alcohol and drinking is part of the Bulgarian culture, and it's probably kind of reflected in the Bulgarian legislation dealing with alcohol advertising. We make this distinction between direct and indirect advertising with respect to spirits, and spirits are hard liquor, very heavy alcohol. And in Bulgaria, direct advertising of hard liquor is prohibited. This means that the advertisers may not show the picture of the beverage or any action related to consumption, production, or distribution. But indirect advertising of hard liquor will be allowed, meaning that they may show just the trade name or the trademark, but not the beverage itself. And with respect to wine and beer, as well as I mentioned, indirect advertising of spirits, we are kind of liberal towards regulation. So first of all, similar to Alex, what you explained about UK, we have to take care really of the interests of minors, so it would not be allowed to target any audience related to people below 18 years, not allowing any minors to participate, and really supporting reasonable consumption, not luring that drinking of any alcohol will bringing success in business, personal life, or allow people to solve their personal problems. And these are the main rules which you have to take care when you are thinking about advertising alcohol in Bulgaria.
Great, thanks. Jacek, thanks.
Thank you. My name is Jacek Myszko. I'm from Poland, from SKS Legal Advisors. I won't give you the full name because it's impossible to pronounce. Advertising of alcoholic beverages in Poland is a tricky task because formally we have a total ban on advertising of alcohol except for beer. Beer is, I would say, it's pretty flexible in terms of advertising. We follow the general rules based on the TV Without Frontiers directive. So we implement them for beer. The rest of this is prohibited, except for certain very limited exceptions for places where alcohol can be consumed or places where alcohol can be sold. So these are the places where you can advertise. The rest of it is banned. So looking from this very formal perspective, direct and indirect advertising is prohibited, but this applies only in theory. In practice, when you look on social media, you will see all sorts of ads of alcoholic brands, starting from beer through wine to hard liquors. This is driven by the fact that Polish definition of advertising and promotion of alcoholic beverages is based on a concept of public dissemination of alcohol-related content. If something is non-public, then technically rules do not apply and you can advertise. So what the industry does in Poland is that the industry claims that, for example, Facebook, since you need to log in, is non-public, it is limited to certain number of users. Even though there are millions of users, they claim it is non-public. And actually, because Polish authority does not have enough resources to enforce, social media became the main source of ads of alcoholic brands. So in Poland, you will see this great discrepancy between what is stated in the law and what reality brings to you.
Great, thank you. Yuri.
Okay. Thank you. I'm Weinstok. I live in Costa Rica. I'm a partner at PLP. We have offices in, of course, in Costa Rica, where I'm from, and also in other Central American countries. Advertising in our jurisdiction is regulated expressly by law, and it needs a prior clearance by an office of the Ministry of Health. In general, the definition of advertising is very wide. So basically, anything you do to promote the sales of a product is advertising, and that falls within the regulation. That's very relevant when we deal with the social media issues later today. Also, there's no distinction as to the percentage of alcohol. Any alcoholic beverage, no matter what percentage it has, will be subject to the same regulations. In terms of the substance, some of the rules are pretty standard, what you would see everywhere else. Like, for example, do not target to children, do not attribute therapeutic qualities to the beverage, and so on. But there are some that are very, very particular. For example, any sort of relationship with sports, any sponsorship or otherwise, is banned. And also, one may not use national symbols to promote advertising. They say that it is to protect children. I don't know what's the reasoning there, but you cannot use national symbols because it is against the health of children. And you cannot use also any famous person to promote alcohol. And that's about it for the moment. Thank you.
Great, thanks. Michel, last but not least.
Thank you. So my name is Michel Béjot. I practice in the law firm Bernard Hertz Béjot, based in Paris. I think, unlike tobacco, that's totally banned in France, advertising for alcohol is not, but it's subject to a lot of restrictions, both legal and self-regulatory. So I would say we're not characterized as dark, but certainly as gray. I'll give you a few points on the environment in which we operate. There are two important parameters in France. One relates to the content of the ad. It is strictly limited and defined by law what can be addressed in the ad, such as origin, composition of the product, modalities of the sale, taste, color, etc. And it has to be objective and informative. And the other parameter is the media allowed. They are listed limitatively. Press for adults, certain categories of radio stations at specific times, billboards, but no TV and no cinema. And we're talking about alcohol now, right? So in light of this, and to put it in simple terms, in France, I think we can say that what is not specifically allowed is prohibited along those two parameters. We have to run, and that's, I think it's in most jurisdictions, we have to run a health message with any ad for alcohol, you know, abuse of alcohol, etc., etc. No sponsorship of sports or cultural events, that's very strictly applied. Definition of drinks, anything above 1.2% is an alcoholic beverage. And regarding age, oddly, French law only refers to young audiences. And from a practical standpoint, all the websites apply the 18-year of age threshold. The French SRO issued guidelines, recommendations, and also in this field, and they give a much more specific reference where the threshold is that the audience under 18 may not exceed 30% of the concerned audience. So that's pretty much the basics we have.
Thank you. Just to clarify, social media permitted or not?
Permitted, but with that threshold I just mentioned.
Yeah, okay. Keep the microphone, Michael, because I think at the beginning I mentioned there are all sorts of weird and wonderful rules around the world, and I do find this French sort of control on the content of the adverts quite strange. So you've got some examples to illustrate what this rule is. Do you want me to start by, I think we've got the Kronenberg advert.
This is a challenge, but we'll try, yeah.
Have a watch of this one, it's entertaining for Michel, would it be useful to show the Havana one to sort of compare and
I think
contrast?
we can go one by one, right? Because I think, this ad gave rise to a protracted series of proceedings. The matter went all the way, first instance appeal, Supreme Court, back to the Court of Appeal. The first Court of Appeal agreed that it was okay. The Supreme Court disagreed, sent it back to another Court of Appeal that said no, it's not compliant. And the reasoning is that it is not fulfilling the first parameter or complying with the first parameter I was referring to at the beginning, which is objective and just, you know, descriptive. And the courts, in the end, decided that it was encouraging consumption. This is where one of the major difficulties lies in France with alcohol advertising, is to define the limit, how far not to go. And
I find it very bizarre that you can say that you can advertise alcohol, but you can't encourage consumption. It seems paradoxical.
Let's continue on the next one, because that one was Pernod Ricard that was considered as compliant, and I don't see how it could have been otherwise. Considered as compliant because all the text, all the information is objective and informative and conforming to the parameter of what's the content that's allowed. Our brilliant, very active association against alcoholism in France that sues virtually every day the businesses sued Pernod Ricard. They lost in first instance, and as far as I know, they didn't go further. They didn't appeal, so that stopped there. This is to put in perspective with the previous one, and with one that I'm sure a lot of you have heard about. That's now old. It's probably 10 years old, but to me it was very sad. It was the Mouette et Chandon advertisement that at the time of Christmas, New Year's Eve, with all kinds of sparkles, you know, like fireworks coming out of the bottle, and with the slogan La Nuit en Rose, the night in pink, which was a direct hint to the Edith Piaf song La Vie en Rose. And it was the same as the beer ad we saw. Series of lawsuits going up all the way to decide that it was an encouragement to drink. And when you see all that, you really wonder who is objective, whether it's the advertisers or the courts, and how you work with this, because how do you sell products when you're not encouraging the purchase, and I assume it's not to throw it out, so the consumption of it. And this is something where I'm worried as a passionate advertising issues, have a great interest. There is an ad for Renault right now that runs on TV this week, where you see someone coming out of his living room, going into his garage, looking at the car, brand new, and saying no, and leaving on a bicycle. And then you see him again in the same ad, it continues, with his wife in the car, leaving. And the ad basically says, the least you can use the car, the better. This is conforming to the current trends on environment protection, but this is insane. They advertise a car and they say don't use it, basically. So I don't know where we're going.
They don't mind if you don't use it, so long as you buy one again in 3 years' time.
and you have the same issue that we all know. It's not alcohol, but the problematic is the same. For vehicles, whether they're 4 wheels or 2, that are designed specifically to go off-road, they are not prohibited. Yeah. You're allowed to buy them. You're allowed to use them under strict conditions. But you're not allowed to advertise them. You're not allowed to show them off-road. So
I do find this idea with alcohol that you can't encourage consumption bizarrely. To me, this advert, even though it is lawful, does encourage consumption.
No, that was considered okay.
It was okay, but to me that encourages consumption.
It does. That's the whole idea of advertising.
Exactly. Very bizarre. Yuri, you've also got another one, and actually while we're talking about cars, this is quite apt, so let's have a look at this one.
Consuma responsablemente.
And that slogan is, some things do not mix.
Exactly. Some
Right.
things do not
So-
mix, just drink responsibly.
Talk us through the advert. And
Well,
what
I
happened.
think that this is a very good example of the question that you made at the beginning on whether regulators are infantilizing consumers. I would say they have been doing it for years, because I mean this ad it's from some time ago, and basically the message is very clear. I mean, some things don't mix. Drink responsibly. I mean, there's not much to it. The regulator did not approve this ad, and basically they were saying that a public health message coming from an alcohol industry company is somehow misleading to consumers, because consumers should not be receiving public health message from someone who sells alcohol. Okay, so they're not only infantilizing, but it also shows like an us versus them mentality by the regulator, that they really distrust the industry, and then they reach these odd decisions that go really against the public health purposes that the law should promote.
And you said that along with a lot of decisions, it's actually the protection of children that is used as the excuse.
That's the standard excuse. For
Yeah.
example, the prohibition of sports and alcohol. There was this law was reformed maybe a year and a half ago, and they said, no, we should allow sponsorships. It's a good way to bring money to sports, to promote sports. And then the Congress approved a reform in the law approving sponsorships, sports sponsorships by alcohol brands. Some association impunched that this law reform at the Constitutional Hall of the Supreme Court. And then the Constitutional Court, they said that it was inconstitutional to link sports and alcohol because of the protection of children. That's all the explanation they gave it. We need to protect children, so sports should not be linked with alcohol. Same thing with the national symbols. You cannot use a flag, national flag, in the advertisement to protect children. So it's kind of like the standard answer to every single question you make the regulator. Their standard answer would be, I'm protecting children.
And in the UK, the protection of children is also very, very high on the agenda in alcohol regulation. But I wanted to share another example with you here.
Before that, I mean, don't get me wrong. I think it is important to protect children.
Yeah.
It's just not using it as an excuse to ban
Exactly.
everything.
Yeah. This is an example in the UK where actually it shows a bit of restraint from the ASA. So in the UK, we have a general rule that you can't advertising can't appeal to children, and it shouldn't include anybody under 25s. And in particular, it talks about not using any characters or cartoons or imagery that would be appealing to children. This is a recent Heineken advert, which is actually playing on the idea that lots of other beers were launching in the metaverse, and people were going and buying, I think, NFT beers and things like that, which of course taste horrible. And this was a campaign about breaking out of the metaverse and having a real beer. So this character was made up for the advert. It isn't a character that's known to children from another game, for example. The fact that she's wearing muted colours, the fact that she's got grey hair, all of these things were pointed to, and the ASA were convinced that indeed this would not appeal particularly to children. So the complaint that was made was not upheld, which I think was probably right. Do people agree?
I'm surprised. When you brought that up, I thought you were going to say that was upheld. I think that illustrates the kind of unpredictability of the ASA, because I could just as easily imagine that going the other way.
Hopefully it also indicates that they're moving with the times, though, because I think today a lot of adults play games and are present in the metaverse, so this sort of character isn't only appealing to children now, it's also what we're seeing as adults in our daily lives. Anyway, an interesting one. Moving on from children, nice segue into sort of social media, which is obviously an appealing channel for for children. Violetta, this is something in Bulgaria that you've faced, and so we don't have an example for this one.
Well, we don't have any specific laws dealing with regulation of influencer marketing or using social media channels. We had those, though, some case law of the Bulgarian Competition Authority, which ruled on several cases that we have to apply the general rules with respect to advertising, including alcohol advertising. And there were several cases not specifically related to alcohol, where the competition authority really applied some fines towards the advertisers and influencers in order to make them apply the general rules. And we see that the competition authority and the other regulators who are the watchdogs for the implementation of the advertising rules with respect to alcohol, and those are the Ministry of Health and the electronic media regulator with respect to advertisements via TV and radio channels. They are also putting a lot of attention on this matter. As he mentioned, in Bulgaria, it's prohibited to target audience of younger people, people below 18 years. Similar to France, there is a case law where such programs should not target 30%, or it's reasonably to expect that younger people below 30% of the audience will be watching or following those programs. And no people below 18 should be participating in any adverts.
Thanks. Obviously, one of the issues with social media is that generally people post on a global basis and aren't geo-blocking. Nick, we were having a conversation earlier about how that really manifests itself in reality in a black market like your own.
Yeah, I think generally the rules around advertising, and not just alcohol, but it could be gambling, or it could be unlicensed or unapproved pharmaceutical type products, etc. For the countries in the region, they tend to kind of assume some local connection. So, for example, if it was a local advertiser advertising any of these products in the jurisdiction, it would be a problem. But if it was a foreign advertiser outside the jurisdiction that just happened to be available on social media in the jurisdiction or online in the jurisdiction, the regulators would not be interested in regulating that. So, I think if you're talking about advertisements that are officially posted on social media, I think they can't, they wouldn't be able to advertise alcohol brands through Facebook or Instagram, for example, because the platform operators don't permit it. But for other advertising more generally that's available online, the local regulators just simply wouldn't be interested. What we do see, so if some advertiser in Saudi did decide to advertise alcohol online, of course it would be a problem because it's illegal, full stop, and the local authorities might go to that person and say, why are you advertising a product that you can't legally buy here? That's probably the least of what they would say. But one thing that we do see in the UAE, in Dubai, for example, Dubai has there's a thing. It used to be a Friday brunch, but now it's a Saturday brunch because they changed the weekend. But these would be sort of all you can eat, all you can drink type brunches. And the traditional approach to advertising those is to refer to things like bottomless grape or bottomless hops or whatever. And that was the sort of local expectation was that wasn't or the perception in the market, which the regulators seem to have simply accepted, is that that's not advertising alcohol because you haven't said beer and you haven't said wine, which is a little bit ridiculous, but it does show the practical, like the black letter versus practical reality of the market. Black letter says you can't advertise alcohol. Meanwhile, you can go to your bottomless grape and bottomless hop brunches. So there is a big gap, and I think it's important to understand that and to appreciate that in some of these jurisdictions you don't necessarily need to take a very literal approach to the extent of the prohibition. The other point that I'll briefly make is that in terms of, and I guess this is more on the ground or in market advertising, but a lot of advertising, you need a permit in order to run the advertisement. So if you were putting a billboard up, for example, the need to get a permit would mean that the company that you're leasing the billboard from for the promotion, they would act as a sort of filter and say, well, we won't be able to get a permit for that, therefore we can't run your advertisement. So I think that's moving away from the social media, but that's another practical consideration. Even if you think you might be able to advertise something, you won't be able to.
I'm conscious of time. I think we've only got about 5 minutes left. We have gone far slower than I'd envisaged. I want to just bring in, Jacek, your example here of a social media where it goes all wrong.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. As mentioned before, social media seems to be this gateway for advertising in Poland. It seems to be very liberal. But I just want to show you that it can go wrong even on social media, and it can go wrong on so many levels. What you see is an ad for Polish vodka, Żytnia vodka, and it doesn't, at first glance, it doesn't seem to be very controversial. You can see men carrying yet another man and type of retro photo, and then the caption says, Cats Vegas, a script written by Żytnia, the vodka. Again, not very controversial. But when you check the actual photo, it shows it was taken in 1982, and it shows protesters carrying yet another protester that was fatally shot. Because it was the time when Poland was under a communist regime still, and there were a lot of violence, a lot of protesting. And this young copywriter, she decided that it would be a great idea to combine this particular picture with vodka advertising.
And the slogan? Explain the slogan.
Yes, and the slogan says that there is the slogan actually says that a script written by Żytnia, but there is yet the comment which says when the bachelor party gets out of control, obviously added by the agency. So it got wrong to the point, to make the whole story short, that criminal charges were raised, and because of slander. This is interesting. It's not because of the advertising, irregularities in the advertising itself, but because it showing these men was considered a slander under Polish criminal law. There was a settlement, civil lawsuit, and it got so wrong that it's one of the more visible examples that even in Poland on social media you need to be careful. So this was my example.
Thank you. We've got a number of more points to go, but I'm take another 5 minutes. Okay. I'm going to skip over though to talking about surrogate advertising and skip on. Violetta has an example here. I talked about it in the briefing, but because you have this distinction between allowing beer but not others,
Yes,
talk us through this.
So this is a case from 2010 actually, and I was not able to dig out the video itself, and we found this in the court file. So we have this Bulgarian producer of hard liquor, Peshtera, and as I mentioned, in Bulgaria, direct advertising of hard liquor is totally prohibited, and there are more restrictions with respect to indirect advertising. And the producer, the advertiser, and the advertising agency came with the idea they will be advertising wine. So we have the spirit on the left side and the wine on the right side. as well as pre-mixed low alcohol beverage, where we see stunning similarity in terms of shape of the bottle, brand name, even the name of the wine was, so the hard liquor, the spirit would be Peștera, and the wine Peșteroca, which is really similar. And with respect to the brandy and the pre-mixed beverage, even they just changed one letter with N and M. Then the competition authority ruled that this is misleading advertising. They fined both the advertiser and the advertising agencies, and under Bulgarian competition law there are really high fines. They might be up to 10% of the annual turnover. And this is a kind of probably set a standard almost more than 10 years ago, where we haven't seen this type of campaigning afterwards. This case went up to the Supreme Court, which confirmed the decision of the competition authority. And as I said, this kind of surrogate advertising it was a good lesson for the other advertisers.
And it's interesting because in the UK we haven't had that sort of issue in relation to alcohol, but with the popularity of 0% beers and spirits coming much stronger now, it is something that the ASA are grappling with, and actually there's draft guidance in place. But I was quite surprised to see the draft guidance. It looks like that they will accept that, for example, Heineken, which is obviously a brand that's associated very strongly with an alcoholic beer, could advertise its 0% under the Heineken brand without too many problems, provided it's clear it's 0%, and actually even has indicated that activities that would be prohibited in alcohol advertisements, such as driving, could be used in the 0% ad, provided, again, it's really clear that you're talking about consuming the 0%. So, yeah, interesting. I don't know whether anybody else has any reflections as to how this is being dealt with in there.
That would be very different in France, because we have a very strict enforcement of the restrictions on indirect advertising. So the way Heineken advertises its 0% beer in France is with all the frills of alcoholic beverages advertising, and with the health mention and all that. So
no 0% alcohol will be able to sponsor sports in France?
No, the name Heineken is not working with sports
because
of that rule of indirect advertising. That's what killed I believe it's what killed the Camel Trophy, that what put Marlboro in such a difficult position, and that what put also a French company making garment had the stupid idea of creating a line of cigarettes. To their defense, they did that exactly at the time when the Loi E20 prohibiting tobacco advertising came out. They had to kill it immediately, or they wouldn't have been able to advertise their clothes. So,
in Poland, we have similar restrictions in terms of 0% alternative to full alcohol beverage. And if there is similarity in terms of identity, in terms of marking, then the same rules apply. It is less as for the full alcohol version. It is less visible in terms of beer, because we still can advertise beer. So 0% beer alternative will be fine. However, in terms of hard liquor, if there is a similarity in this graphic identity, it will not be possible to advertise in Poland.
There's one very quick thing I want to add relating to show that our environment is a little strict. Concerning the what they call the hard seltzers, we have a draft law in progress, and I believe it will be adopted, that prohibits the use of the word water, in connection with those drinks.
And what about non-alcohol but alcohol substitutes? So like seedlip, which is like a gin substitute, but there isn't a seedlip alcohol version. It's all non-alcohol. How would that be treated in France and the Middle East, for example?
Well, non-alcohol, if it's not with such a prestigious name that is so connected to alcohol like Heineken, that's okay then. Because there is no indirect advertisement.
In Saudi recently, I did actually see an evening advertised at a hotel where it had all these, fancy non-alcohol cocktails. It was like a cocktail evening type thing, and they I think they were brands that are only non-alcoholic. So there wasn't like the Tanqueray 00 sort of scenario. Like you wouldn't know these brands. And yeah, that was advertised. So there's nothing illegal about advertising non-alcohol in that context. But then the question is, what about for, say, Heineken 00 or whatever, or Tanqueray 00? And interestingly, like non-alcohol or zero alcohol beers, I've recently noticed on the shelves in the supermarket in Saudi, and they're 0.0. But if they went to 2 decimal places, they're not 0. So that in itself is somewhat revolutionary that they're available in the market. But I think that the regulators in Saudi, they're not so sophisticated that, unlike France, where, and I forget the exact expression that you use, but it says you can't advertise alcohol. It doesn't say, something sort of like alcohol, or sorry, what did you say about the, the terminology that you use, I've forgotten. But
alcohol alternatives.
Yeah, well, just the fact that people might associate it is not something that I think the regulator has a particular position on.
But I suppose in a truly black market, people don't associate any drinks with alcohol because they're not
used to them. Whereas Seedlip, when I saw how it was advertised, I actually thought it was an alcoholic drink. I didn't realise it was non-alcoholic, bizarrely. But anyway, I'm very conscious of time. We need to wrap up. I know that there's another break now, but what I'd suggest is that we maybe can sit here for another 5-10 minutes if anybody does have questions, but feel free to leave and just come forward and ask us questions if you have any. Thank you very much for attending and choosing the session.